Hello, everybody. So I guess it's time to get started, about 3 o'clock, so sounds like the right time. Thank you all for joining us. As you all know, these presentations are the culmination of many months of work and research, and so we're excited to be up here today and share everything with you, and honored to have you all in the audience. My name is Gioia. Chloe Lewis could not be with us today in person, but she's joining us from the cloud, from Denver, and Brian Lieberman. And our project, there's Chloe. Hi, Chloe. And our project, or our panel, is Navigating Change, Shifting Socioeconomic Landscapes in Land Management. So, navigating change, what does that mean? Each of our projects has identified some sort of shift in one or more of economic, social, and or environmental landscapes. We've also identified resulting challenges associated with these shifts for the agencies or organizations that we worked for. Navigating change, what we really mean by this is we're talking about adaptation. Adaptation of management, adaptation within agencies and organizations. And the goal in adaptation that we'll get into in the context of each of our projects, but the primary goal for this is to create adaptation strategies that are equitable, effective, and actionable. And each of us will explain to you how our projects worked in one or more of these shifting landscapes and worked towards adaptation strategies that achieve those goals. So the challenges that our projects seek to manage or contribute to, for the agencies and organizations we worked for, they're really relatively new or novel or emerging challenges. Shifting landscapes are presenting exactly that, emerging challenges that have kind of not yet previously been worked on. And so each of our projects identified creative approaches to researching and managing for these challenges. And we'll each get into the integrated approaches that we developed, but basically what I'm talking about, this could include the use of geospatial technology and other kind of broad scale options for looking at management from a broad perspective. Does that mean 2 minutes left or 2 minutes into? Left. Okay. Using interviews and surveys as well, so approaching issues from multiple perspectives. And then in the adaptation context, since each of our projects works in the realm of adaptation for management in some way, just wanted to lay the framework and foundation for the adaptation process. So each of our projects kind of fits into one or more of these steps. The first step is identifying some sort of management challenge. What is presenting a challenge to management? From there, we can move towards collecting data to describe that issue, describe that challenge. This is kind of like collecting baseline data. From there, we can begin to develop management actions. And these management actions are aimed at relieving some sort of stressor, maybe reducing vulnerability, or managing for that challenge in some way. After developing those actions, we move into implementing strategies, but it doesn't stop there. We can continue to visit each one of these steps, continuously identify emerging challenges, collecting more data, monitoring those strategies, and developing further actions to reach that goal of achieving strategies that are equitable, effective, and actionable. And that takes me to my project, which was the Colorado BLM Social Vulnerability Assessment, Livelihoods, Management, and Climate Change. This was a collaborative project. It is a collaborative project of the entities listed there below: the Bureau of Land Management, Colorado State University, the North Central Climate Science Center, and Western. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction, kind of overview of my project, talk a little bit more about the different project activities that I engaged in, and then share some key findings from my research. So my project, as it is a social vulnerability assessment, I wanted to begin with a definition of vulnerability. So in academic research and climate change adaptation practice, vulnerability is commonly accepted and defined as having three different components. So I want to share those with you now. The first component of vulnerability is exposure. And this is the degree to which a system is exposed to climate change. And when I say a system, that could be whatever you're focused on assessing the vulnerability of, whether a wildlife species, an ecosystem, a group of people. And so this looks at climate and weather, both in the present tense and into the future, and looks at what sort of climate change that system could be facing. So this is kind of really like a quantitative aspect of vulnerability. From there, we can begin to look at sensitivity, which is the degree to which a system is affected by climate. So when we understand the exposure, then we can ask, well, how dependent is the system on climate? Will it be, how will it be affected by those changes in climate? Is it dependent on climate such as agriculture or outdoor recreation, or less dependent? So those two components kind of work together to heighten, perhaps, a system's vulnerability. And they're moderated by the ability to adapt. So what is the adaptive capacity? The ability to adjust to climate change. And once we have an understanding of those three components, that gives us a broad understanding of vulnerability, the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change. So just a little context here of why this is important for a land management agency. The Department of the Interior houses several different federal land management agencies, including the BLM. And in 2014, the DOI published its Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which, among other things, mandated that agencies like the BLM conduct vulnerability assessments so that they could consider climate change in future planning and management. And for an agency such as the BLM that manages resources for multiple use, so it manages ecosystems, but also the uses of the ecosystems, it became important to assess the vulnerability of both of those as well, both the ecological side and the social side. So throughout the western US and Colorado, two of the most common uses of public lands and BLM managed lands are livestock ranching and recreation. And for this vulnerability assessment, for the Colorado statewide assessment, well, that's what this project focused on up until for now. So my contributions to this project included a spatial assessment, working on a literature review, and a case study. And I'm going to kind of gloss over the literature review. I'm going to totally skip over the spatial assessment, and because I want to get into the case study, and I'll show you where you can find out more about the spatial assessment if you would like. The literature review it's a journal article that we prepared and submitted to the Journal of Climate Risk Management. It's currently under review. But the main finding from this review was a methodological framework that kind of put forth some key design principles or key elements that any social vulnerability assessment for public land management should consider. And this diagram kind of sums up that finding. So we thought that those three elements would be an investigation of institution-actor relationships, which is kind of like a fancy way of just saying relationships between BLM management or just agency management and permitted users. Also including stakeholders, both, again, BLM management, federal agency management, and permitted users, getting them to participate in the research process, and integrating top-down, that could be kind of broad scale, geospatial, or some other sort of quantitative data, giving you the kind of 50,000 foot view, integrating that with bottom-up, more very fine scale, perhaps interview-based or survey data. So integrating those two to get a real holistic picture. So we took those findings from the literature review and applied them to our methodological approach for the case studies. So this shows the field office boundaries throughout Colorado. And I was responsible for conducting a case study at the Gunnison office, and there was a parallel study going on at the Little Snake field office. So the methods in response to our literature review, the primary method for this case study was using interviews with both, so I conducted 32 interviews within the Gunnison field office area with both BLM officials, livestock ranchers, and recreation outfitters, and did this over a period of about 4 months from December to this past March. And now I just want to share some key findings from those interviews focused on social vulnerability, both sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and then some real initial ideas and opportunities for adaptation. All right, so livestock ranchers. Sensitivities that we've discussed in interviews were really focused on BLM management, whether that had to do with grazing restrictions, management style, or certain restrictions that BLM is under, different personnel. Talked extensively about climate and weather, both climate and weather events that ranchers are very dependent upon, such as the specific timing of certain events, like when it rains throughout summer, when it snows, when it warms up in the spring, dependent upon snowpack. And also specific events that ranchers are sensitive to, like prolonged drought or other severe events. We also discussed several other sensitivities. A major one that came up quite a lot was the increasing use of public lands in the area for recreation and conflicts that come along with that. Pressure from environmental and advocacy groups and the public to decrease the use of public lands for grazing, and just broader scale economic patterns impacting business operations, ranch operations. So moving to adaptive capacity, some other key findings from interviews in the context of BLM management, thinking about those relationships. We had a lot of discussions on relationships and on trust, and there was a general feeling portrayed from ranchers that more positive relationships built on a higher level of trust afforded greater adaptability to respond proactively to adverse weather impacts. In terms of climate and weather, the adaptive capacity of ranchers kind of fell in the area of, talked a lot about making range improvements, so doing specific projects on grazing allotments to improve the efficiency of the use of those allotments, and other things that folks do in response to perhaps being held off of their grazing on public lands because of bad weather conditions that affect the growth of grass. And that could be importing feed or selling cattle or leasing private land. And those actions were really talked about as kind of like last-ditch efforts and very difficult to sustain over a long period of time, even a short period of time. And other assistance options were discussed as well, like government funding programs, grant programs. Some folks did have access to more private land, and that afforded greater adaptability if they weren't able to graze on public land, and social networks as well. So opportunities for adaptation, initial ideas, focusing on opportunities for improving or just looking at relationships and thinking about ways to build relationships and build trust with permitted users, and also looking at the permitting process and thinking about are there any opportunities within the current kind of regulatory framework to be a little more adaptable and reactive to weather conditions kind of as they arise throughout the year. And I just wanted to share one quote here, as one rancher said, and I thought it's going to be hard to utilize those permits in the correct manner to where we don't damage them, but we did, and we had the flexibility from the specialists, and they basically trusted us to do what we needed to do. We didn't go by dates, we just went by utilization. And this came from someone who had clearly built up a very strong relationship that was built on trust over very long, many years, but it reflects what a lot of folks were saying about those strong, positive relationships. Moving right along to recreation outfitters, similar themes for sensitivities, sensitivities to you talked a lot about the permitting process, and I'll try to get into that in a minute, but also talked about climate and weather, very similar sensitivities and dependencies to ranchers, the timing of events, snowpack, and the level of rivers and wildlife habitat, and then local and greater scale economics as well. Adaptive capacity discussions with recreation outfitters were kind of a little more nuts and bolts sort of stuff, but one that came up quite a lot was experience, and if certain areas are adversely affected by weather, if the habitat is affected for hunting, or if streams are unfishable, or certain areas are closed off for access, the more knowledge and longevity folks had, the better able they were to kind of adapt to that and shift to another area. Opportunities for adaptation to, and I should say that adaptation in this context and the previous is looking at increasing the adaptive capacity, reducing sensitivities. So a lot of discussions were focused on just the permitting process, and it's on a yearly basis. So folks will apply for their permit, and talked a lot about once the permit is granted, they don't have any options for maybe changing that within the season, changing the area of use or the timing of use. And management and restoration was also discussed quite a lot too, as climate change and other factors affect habitat and streams and rivers and forests, looking at opportunities to just increase the resiliency of those resources. So as one outfitter said, if it gets up to 60 degrees in late February, we'll start getting really big runoff, and if our permit has not started by then, that would be the only suggestion, is adjusting maybe the season start. And this just kind of reflects what several people were talking about with, if it gets unseasonably warm and we have the opportunity to take trips out, really early in the year or something like that, that would be great if we could do that. So in conclusion, as I've discussed, this panel is really about navigating change. In this project, the social vulnerability assessment was really the results of climate change and the DOI's climate change adaptation plan, and the need to conduct vulnerability assessments. So through our research in developing this approach that includes stakeholders, both permitted users and BLM, we are confident and hopeful that we'll end up in the future creating adaptation strategies that are effective, equitable, and actionable. And big thanks to Dr. Corey Knapp, my research team, the Social Vulnerability Assessment research team, Brian St. George, my community sponsor, if he's possibly joining us online, I don't know. Thank you, Brian. And you all in here, and yeah, if you want to see, there's tons more information on this project on my website as well, and I invite you to check that out. And that's it. Thank you. All right, cool.
I love the cows thinking.
Yeah.
Thought bubbles.
They think a lot. Thank you. Yes,
I'm just wondering if you think this framework is can be extended to natural resource extraction, perhaps mining, natural gas extraction on BLM land.
on BLM land. In the sense of
Identifying kind of the risks and uncertainties and if there's an adaptive capacity for, land management to maybe perhaps engage in a responsible resource extraction, if that's something.
I suppose it could, definitely. I mean, our review and the approach that we developed was really in the context of, I would say, climate-dependent livelihoods, and like livestock ranching and outdoor recreation. I'd say it's perhaps not mutually exclusive to climate-dependent livelihoods, so it could include an assessment for that in that context, but we did not enter that realm in our research. Yeah.
John, I got a pretty good sense of the results of the case study from the permittees, from 2 different types of permittees, but less of a sense from the interviews with the BLM personnel.
Mm-hmm.
And what some of the results of that might have been in terms of what they felt like needed to happen for adaptation, ultimately. If they were, like, for example, permits came up twice as, the need for more flexibility. Just curious.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was I'd say a limitation of the amount of time I had. But it's interesting, once I had done all the interviews and started looking at the data and coming up with not only the sensitivities and adaptive capacities, but the opportunities for adaptation, that's when looking back at interviews with BLM folks became really helpful to look at, because a lot of our conversations with those interviews came to sort of constraints that the management specialists are kind of up against in terms of managing kind of more flexibly, or more, with the ability to adapt to the permitting process. So I don't know if I could get into all that now, but there's definitely, a lot of those interviews did focus on the constraints that and perhaps opportunities as well for those adaptations. But moving on to like the final opportunities for adaptation, I think will require more work with BLM to understand what they're, what's actually possible and what they're capable of. Yes?
What lessons did you learn about framing the issue of climate change differently as you approach different stakeholders?
Well, it is, apparently it's a pretty big political issue.
So did you find some openings out of a very divisive and sometimes stale conversation?
Some openings. Well, it always kind of seemed like, we designed all of our outreach material and our questions, our interview questions, really just to not even use the term or the phrase climate change, just because of its being sort of a hot button political issue. So I just
What phrases
kind of
did you use?
When it snows?
Words like drought.
weather variability, weather impacts, drought, these sorts of weather impacts that people are dealing with. That's it.